Hi everyone, and welcome to the second in our conversation series, which is about handling disruption in supply contracts. So when we were first talking, Bryn, we were really at the height of lockdown, weren't we? And now we're moving into some form of new normal, but I think it's fair to say we're still experiencing a lot of disruption, and this is feeding through to contracts as well between suppliers and customers. So I would say, for example, that hospitality and events are being particularly hard hit at the moment. So one of the key clauses we're going to look at today is the clause force majeure, which is attracting a lot of attention because actually it's a way for parties to be able to avoid liability if they're not performing or delay their performance. But it's also quite often misunderstood, isn't it, and used incorrectly.
It is, yes, and hopefully we can put straight some of those confusions today. To kick us off, Claire, I'm going to ask the obvious question, what is force majeure?
Well, it's a pretty fancy French word, isn't it? But it doesn't actually have any specific meaning in law. The force majeure clause in a contract is pretty standard, actually. It covers times when something unexpected or outside of a party's control happens, and then it relieves them from actually having to strictly comply with their obligations.
So you mentioned something unexpected happening. What sort of events typically will fall into that category in a force majeure clause?
Okay, so you'll find two types of force majeure clauses, the really super detailed ones with specific examples of events. War, terrorism, earthquakes, acts of God, that kind of thing. And then you'll often see epidemic or pandemic in there as well. Other types of examples are government restrictions, strikes. So the examples I'm giving you are the kind of things that might happen which are not contemplated, that are outside of the control of the parties. You also might see a really simple clause which just describes it as an event outside of the party's control and doesn't provide a list.
Sonic booms are also found on force majeure clauses. Sometimes that's very much a favourite of mine. There haven't been too many of them recently, as far as I know, but obviously there is a pandemic going on and there are government restrictions in response to it. So how would those two things fit within your typical force majeure clause?
Yes, right. Well, obviously the first thing you're looking at is if the actual event has occurred or not. So I think we can safely say that if you've got pandemic listed as a force majeure event, then that's really going to cover what's going on with COVID-19 at the moment. I think the other thing that's really relevant is the category of government restrictions, because we're getting new government orders all the time that we can't predict. I think more generally, if you've got the statement outside of the party's control, then pandemic will be covered by that.
Okay, thanks. So is that all we need then, just for the listed event or the relevant event to occur, or do we need a bit more than that? I have a feeling you're going to tell me we do need a bit more.
Exactly. You've got to start off in establishing that there's the event, and then you need to kind of look at 3 steps, really. You need to create a link between the event and the fact that you can't perform or your performance is being delayed. So you need to make the connection. The second thing you need to do is you need to show that non-performance was due to circumstances beyond your control. And the third thing you need to do usually is to take reasonable steps so that you're avoiding the consequences or you're mitigating the impact in some way.
Okay, so I know clients have been coming to us with force majeure issues. Could you give us some real-world examples that would illustrate what you're talking about?
Definitely. And I would say my general feel for this is it's not a clause that's that easy to rely on at the moment. And I'll give you a couple of examples to show why. So one example was an events contract, and it was for a conference for 500 people that was going to be held. Now, clearly that conference couldn't go ahead. And so they were looking to rely on the force majeure clause to cancel the contract. But actually, when we looked at it, there was a reasonable step that they could take, and they could move it online. So actually, the conference could carry on and say that's what they decided to do. And so they didn't rely on the clause, and they wouldn't have been able to. The second one is quite an interesting one. It's where an airline, and airlines have been really impacted at the moment, but they had a contract with the supplier, and essentially they were saying that they weren't going to pay based on the fact that they see the COVID pandemic as a force majeure event. But the thing is, their operations were back up again, planes were flying, and they've even got the funds to pay. I think, to be honest, they were just looking to cut costs. So in circumstances like this, where it's just inconvenient for them, basically they couldn't rely on the clause.
Okay, so I think I've got the principle down pat. But what are the formalities for invoking a force majeure clause? Because we all know that lawyers love their formalities. So what are they?
Yeah, quite. Well, again, they're going to be contract specific, Bryn. And some of these formalities are quite useful. Clearly, there's going to be some form of notice that needs to be given. And so you need to follow the provisions in the contract that tell you what the formality for the serving the notice is going to be. And also, you normally tend to see timescales within which you need to serve the notice or how long the event's been continuing for. So really, you just need to read the provision in the contract and follow it.
Okay, thanks. So if we followed the formalities correctly on all well, what will be the effect of relying on the force majeure clause?
Well, this is why they're so popular, Bryn, because essentially the obligations are suspended. So the party who's essentially not able to perform the services doesn't have to perform, and they're not going to be liable during that period. Also, look out for clauses that tell you that there's an extension of time. So they might have longer to be able to perform their services. And the other thing to look out for is ultimately, if this is an event that's continuing, nothing's happening, nothing is being performed, then it could lead to termination for the party who's not been affected, for the unaffected party.
Okay. And obviously as well, there are going to be hopefully negotiations between the parties to try and get through this problem.
Exactly, and that's a good point, and we talked about it in the first video, didn't we? That actually, if we're kind of reaching this point where the service has been disrupted in some way, well, really the first thing you really want to do is to have that conversation early. It could be that they need to go down the route of relying on the force majeure clause. More likely, though, and I've certainly seen this in practice, that to sustain the relationship, the parties have a discussion. They look to see whether they might be able to change the scope of the services. They might even reduce the fees. So, yes, they definitely want to do that. And if they're going to vary the contract, of course, then there's another set of requirements to look at in the contract, because they're going to need to make sure it's documented and agreed in writing so that it's enforceable.
Okay, thanks. So let's look at it the other way around then. What do we do if we receive a force majeure notice from the affected party?
Well, not panic. Check, make sure that the notice has actually been served correctly. You also want to check and see if it's justified. As I said, it can be quite difficult to rely on these clauses. And also, if the notice hasn't been served correctly and your supplier, for example, is sitting on their hands and not performing the services when they should be, well, in fact, the supplier is the one who's in breach of contract. And you, the party who's actually receiving that notice, you could be the one having the right to terminate or recover damages if you're suffering loss.
Okay, one thing that has received a lot of attention is the impact of the pandemic on consumers. So are there any particular considerations that a business needs to have in mind if they interact with consumers?
Yes, it's a good point, because you've got the Consumer Rights Act, you've got consumer law that is always a factor when you're looking at a contract. And the two key areas are fairness and transparency. So you've got to make sure that your clauses have those. So the first thing you have to make sure is that the event you're relying on is genuinely outside of the supplier's control. Otherwise, it's going to be considered unfair and not valid. I think the other thing is you're not going to see the words force majeure or you shouldn't see one really in a consumer contract. I think the regulator much prefers it if you use plain English and just talk about it being an event outside of control. I think the final thing, and which is really important, is if there's going to be a risk of substantial delay, then the guidance that the regulator is giving is it's giving that consumer the right to terminate the agreement, and also, importantly, and challenging for businesses, that it's going to give the consumer the right to a refund of prepaid amounts. And certainly events contracts and online bookings for holidays and accommodation are really the ones that are suffering the most here.
So I think we've covered force majeure pretty much. Obviously, to it, but I think that's a pretty good introduction. I think. Let's just change tack a bit. What about frustration? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so it's a legal doctrine. We're kind of looking at different avenues of what you do if your performance is compromised because of disruption, let's say due to the pandemic. But frustration is really difficult to prove even in the current circumstances. So this is where your contract's actually impossible to perform. The event is completely unforeseen, and it would be completely unfair to have the parties to continue being held by the contract. So, an example of this where the contract was seen to be frustrated was when war broke out and the government banned the works covered under the contract and they seized and sold the equipment. So, basically, it was impossible. So I think if we think about the current situation now, you're not going to be able to rely on this to bring a contract to an end just because performance has become more difficult or costly for you.
Oh, how very frustrating that is. Thank you, Claire, for that introduction to force majeure and frustration briefly. Do you think you could just summarise what we've talked about today, please?
Yes, definitely. So in a nutshell, do consider the precise wording of the clause and check if what you're trying to rely on is covered under it. Do remember to take those reasonable steps to kind of mitigate any loss or make sure that performance can still go ahead. You can't just sit on your hands. Do look at the notice and time requirements and make sure you follow them properly. And then also do look at other routes and remedies, either under your contract or because you're negotiating with the other party and you're agreeing a binding variation between you. Okay, so that's it from us today. Thank you for your time, Bryn, and thanks everyone for listening. We hope you found it useful. Do look out for the next and last in our series, which is going to look at termination and liability clauses in commercial contracts. But for now, if you want to know more about the General Counsel Service, check out the link below, or even better, get in touch with one of us.